A park encounter. The crisp morning air hummed with the gentle rustle of leaves in Riverside Park. Karen Whitfield strode purposefully along the path, her designer sneakers pounding against the gravel as she moved with the confidence of someone who saw herself as the epitome of suburban success. At 45, she had perfected an image that she believed reflected her status. Polished blonde hair, designer workout gear, and a handbag that whispered affluence. As she rounded a bend, her eyes fell on a figure slouched on a nearby bench, just by the duck pond she adored. The man was dressed in worn, faded clothes and had a weary look, his face partially shadowed by an old baseball cap. His belongings, all he seemed to own, were packed in a modest backpack beside him. But what caught Karen's attention, more than anything, was his appearance, his dark skin, his unkempt attire, and his quiet presence on her bench. Her lips curled into a sneer as she approached, her grip tightening on her handbag. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice carrying an air of authority. "You can't just loiter here. This is a public park, not a place to sleep." The man stirred, blinking against the brightness of the morning as he adjusted his cap. His eyes, tired yet gentle, met hers as he slowly straightened. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to cause any trouble," he murmured, his voice rough from sleep. "I'll move." But Karen wasn't satisfied. She crossed her arms, her gaze sharp and unyielding. She saw this as a threat to her comfortable world, as though his very presence on her favorite bench tainted it somehow. It wasn't just the man himself that stirred something within her. It was what he represented, a disruption to her carefully maintained life. "No," she pressed, her voice laced with contempt. "People like you don't belong here. You're making this place unsafe for decent folks." The man's shoulders sagged, the weariness in his eyes deepening. He began to gather his things, resigned to move along, as he had many times before. But as he packed up his belongings, Karen pulled out her phone, dialing with brisk determination. "Yes, 911. She said, her voice slipping into a tone laced with exaggerated concern. "There's a homeless man in Riverside Park. He's behaving aggressively, and I don't feel safe. Could you please send someone quickly?" As she spoke, other park visitors had slowed, catching snippets of her words. An elderly couple feeding ducks exchanged disapproving glances, while a mother jogging with a stroller shook her head subtly, her eyes darkening with concern. The man on the bench, John Williams, listened to Karen's call, a mixture of disbelief and resignation washing over his face. At 58, John had long since grown accustomed to the looks of suspicion and the false accusations that often came with being homeless and black. After serving his country for over 20 years, he'd returned home to a life filled with hardship and struggle. PTSD and a series of unfortunate events had left him without a steady job, and soon, without a home. But Karen was oblivious to this. Her focus was on herself and the disruption she perceived this man had brought into her peaceful world. She didn't notice the curious, disapproving glances from bystanders or the quiet murmur of discontent around her. In the distance, the sound of sirens grew louder. John sat back down, his bag on his lap as he waited, his eyes turning toward the path ahead. He knew this routine all too well. The questions, the suspicious looks, the unspoken assumptions of guilt that came before any real conversation. 2 police cruisers rolled up to the park's entrance, and Karen's expression transformed into one of smug satisfaction. She straightened her shoulders and adopted a look of mock concern, her mind already shaping a story where she played the role of a good citizen. The first officer, Michael Rodriguez, approached her with a calm, professional demeanor. His partner, Sarah Thompson, followed closely, glancing around as if assessing the situation. "Good morning, ma'am," Officer Rodriguez began, his voice even. "We received a call about a suspicious person." "Yes, officer," Karen replied, slipping easily into her role. "This man was sleeping on the bench, and when I asked him to leave, he became aggressive. I didn't feel safe." The officers exchanged a glance before turning their attention to John, who remained seated, his hands visible on his lap. There was something about his quiet dignity, despite his circumstances, that struck a chord with Officer Rodriguez. "Sir, could you tell us your name?" Rodriguez asked, his tone noticeably softer. "John Williams," he replied, his voice steady. "I apologize if I caused any disturbance. I was just resting for a bit. I'll leave if that's what's needed." As John spoke, Officer Rodriguez noticed a familiar look in his eyes, a certain weight in his demeanor, a stillness that he recognized from his own time in the service. "Mr. Williams," Rodriguez asked, his tone cautious but respectful, "were you in the military?" John's eyes flickered with surprise, meeting Rodriguez's gaze. "Yes, sir. Marine Corps, 23 years. Rodriguez nodded, a look of understanding passing between them. "Thank you for your service, Mr. Williams," he said with quiet sincerity. Karen, who had been standing by impatiently, interrupted with growing irritation. "Excuse me, but what does this have to do with anything? This man is trespassing. I demand that you remove him." Officer Rodriguez turned back to Karen, his expression hardening just slightly. "Ma'am, being homeless is not a crime, and Mr. Williams has every right to be here, just like anyone else." Karen's face flushed with indignation. She pulled out her phone again, this time pointing it at the officers. "I can't believe this. I'm going to report this to your superiors. You're refusing to protect tax-paying citizens." The raised tone of Karen's voice attracted more attention from other parkgoers, who now watched the scene unfold with growing interest. Officer Thompson stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, please lower your voice. We're assessing the situation, as we're trained to do." Officer Rodriguez turned back to John, speaking in a low voice. "Mr. Williams, have you been in contact with the VA? There are programs that can help with housing and support." John nodded, though his expression was weary. "I've tried, officer. The waiting lists are long, and the process is difficult, especially with PTSD." Rodriguez reached into his pocket, pulling out a business card. "I know someone at the local veteran center, Dave Martinez. He's good at navigating the system. Tell him Mike Rodriguez sent you." As the officers and John conversed, Karen grew more agitated, her frustration boiling over. She raised her phone higher, still recording. "This is unacceptable. I'm a taxpayer. I have rights." Her angry rant continued, but the officers maintained their calm, focusing on John. Meanwhile, several bystanders had begun recording the interaction on their phones, capturing Karen's tirade in all its unfiltered vitriol. Officer Rodriguez, having finished his conversation with John, turned back to Karen with a firm voice. "Ma'am, calling 911 under false pretenses is a serious offense. Mr. Williams has done nothing wrong." Karen's eyes widened, disbelief and anger mingling on her face as she stormed away, still recording, muttering about her taxes and rights. As she left, Officer Rodriguez handed John a $20 bill for bus fare. "Take care, Mr. Williams. Don't forget to call that number." John's eyes misted over with gratitude. It had been a long time since anyone had shown him such kindness. He held the officer's gaze and managed a quiet, "Thank you, sir." Little did they know that this encounter was only the beginning. Both Karen and John were about to find their lives deeply, unexpectedly intertwined in ways neither could have foreseen. Karen's public reckoning. Later that night, Karen Whitfield paced her tastefully decorated living room, her manicured fingers tapping rhythmically against her phone as she crafted the perfect social media post. She'd been composing it in her mind since she left the park, her heart still racing with anger and indignation. This was supposed to be her chance to assert herself, to show the world she was a force to be reckoned with, someone who wouldn't stand for vagrants ruining her community. Her fingers flew over the screen as she typed, recounting her morning in the park. She painted herself as the concerned citizen, standing up against an intimidating presence. She chose her words carefully, describing the police as dismissive and negligent. Shocked and appalled by the state of our community, she wrote, "This morning I encountered a suspicious man loitering in our beloved Riverside Park. When I asked him to leave, he became aggressive, so I called the police. But when they arrived, they treated me like I was the problem. Is this where our tax dollars are going? To protect the homeless over us, the hard-working people who pay their salaries." Satisfied with her narrative, she hit post and watched as the likes and comments began trickling in, each one a balm to her wounded pride. People echoed her outrage, some even offering to join her in a community watch to keep Riverside Park safe. For the first time since that morning, Karen felt validated, even vindicated. But she couldn't have known that other people had also posted about the incident, people who had captured the entire exchange on video. By the next morning, the social media landscape had shifted drastically. The sound of her phone buzzing roused Karen from her sleep. She blinked at the blinding glow of notifications, her heart sinking as she noticed the tone of the comments. Messages that had initially been supportive were now peppered with words like disgrace, racist, and pathetic. Frowning, she clicked on a link someone had shared in the comments. It led to a video clip recorded from across the park, where her voice rang out clear as day. "People like you don't belong here. You're making this place unsafe for decent folks." Her stomach twisted as she realized her tirade was now playing out for everyone to see. She watched herself in disbelief, her own sneer reflected back at her, her voice laced with entitlement. This was the version of her that she'd hoped to conceal, the ugliness she'd thought no one else would see. As the clip continued, the camera zoomed out to show Officer Rodriguez calmly speaking to the man on the bench, addressing him respectfully as a veteran. The contrast between her behavior and the officer's compassion was painfully clear. Karen's heart pounded as she scrolled further. Other videos showed different angles, each more damning than the last. The comments below the posts were brutal. "Disgusting behavior. She should be ashamed. Imagine having that much hate for a man just trying to survive. This is why people have such a hard time trusting others. This woman clearly has a problem." The narrative she'd crafted for herself was crumbling, and with it, her carefully maintained image. But what shook her most were the direct messages pouring into her inbox. Friends she'd known for years distanced themselves, people she respected condemned her, and strangers berated her. She slammed her phone down, but the words continued to echo in her mind, a litany of shame. By noon, her entire world had shifted. She walked into her office with her head down, avoiding eye contact with coworkers who whispered behind her back. Her boss called her into his office, his face hard with disapproval. "Karen," he began, barely containing his anger, "we're receiving calls from clients, and it's not good. They're threatening to pull their business because of your behavior. This is a company that prides itself on inclusion and respect. I'm afraid we're going to have to terminate your employment." Her jaw dropped. She could feel the weight of the last 24 hours crashing down on her all at once. You can't be serious. I've worked here for 15 years. Your work doesn't excuse your actions. I'm sorry, but this kind of behavior is unacceptable. Please collect your things." As she packed up her desk, Karen felt her face burn with humiliation. She could feel her coworkers' eyes on her, judgment heavy in their gazes. The world she'd known, her work, her social life, her status, was slipping through her fingers. And for the first time, she felt a pang of regret, a whisper of self-doubt creeping in beneath her anger. Meanwhile, across town, John Williams sat in a quiet room at the local veteran center. Dave Martinez, the veteran advocate Officer Rodriguez had recommended, sat across from him, paperwork spread out on the table. "I'm glad you came in, Mr. Williams," Dave said warmly. "We have some programs that might be able to help. Though I won't lie to you, it's a process." John looked around, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. "It's been a long time since someone offered me a hand," he admitted. "I've gotten used to doing things on my own." Dave nodded in understanding. "I get it, but we're here to help, and we'll take this one step at a time." You serve your country. You deserve a shot at getting back on your feet. As they worked through the forms, John found himself beginning to relax. For the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path, even if the journey ahead was daunting. With the support of the center and Officer Rodriguez's encouragement, he dared to hope for a fresh start. After an hour, Dave handed him a card. "This is my personal number. If you need anything, even just to talk, give me a call." John's eyes misted as he took the card, grateful beyond words. He tucked it into his pocket, a tangible reminder that someone cared, that he wasn't as invisible as he'd begun to feel. Days passed, and the news of Karen's actions spread further. She found herself effectively exiled from her social circles. Friends who once flocked to her now kept their distance, wary of the backlash that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. Even her family had distanced themselves, embarrassed by her behavior. She spent her days hiding in her house, consumed by a mix of shame and bitterness, wondering how everything had spiraled so disastrously out of control. Then one evening, as she sat on her couch scrolling aimlessly through job listings, she saw a notification that caught her eye. The Veterans Center had posted a story about John Williams, highlighting his service and his struggles to reintegrate into civilian life. The post praised his resilience and hinted at his plans to turn his life around with the help of the community. Karen stared at the post, feeling something shift within her. She couldn't shake the memory of the man she'd berated in the park, the quiet dignity with which he'd faced her anger. In that moment, Karen recognized that this story wasn't just about John's struggle, it was about her own. Setting her phone down, Karen took a deep breath, and for the first time, she allowed herself to confront the reality of her actions. She realized that she'd been so focused on her own image, her own grievances, that she'd failed to see John as a person. To her, he'd been a symbol of something to be dismissed, even feared. And in that moment, she saw how far she'd fallen from the person she thought she was. The next morning, Karen found herself walking back to Riverside Park, her heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and determination. She'd avoided the park ever since that morning, terrified of seeing anyone who'd witnessed her behavior. But today, she had a different purpose. She didn't know if John would be there, but she felt compelled to try. As she approached the familiar bench, her heart sank. He wasn't there. She waited for a while, hoping he might appear, but the minutes ticked by, and the park remained quiet. Just as she was about to leave, she noticed an elderly woman feeding the ducks nearby, who glanced her way with a faint look of recognition. Summoning her courage, Karen approached. "Excuse me, ma'am. Do you know if a man named John, a veteran, comes here often?" The woman eyed her warily, her expression guarded. "You mean the gentleman you caused trouble for last week?" Karen's face flushed with embarrassment, but she nodded. "Yes, I want to apologize. I was wrong." The woman softened slightly, sensing the genuine remorse in Karen's voice. "John's been staying at the Veterans Center downtown. They're helping him get back on his feet." Karen thanked her and turned back down the path, her mind racing. The Veterans Center was only a few miles away. She didn't know what she would say when she got there, or if John would even agree to speak with her, but she knew she had to try. As she walked toward her car, she felt the weight of her past actions pressing down on her. But for the first time, she also felt a glimmer of something else, a determination to make things right. The path to redemption, she realized, wouldn't be easy, but it was one she was finally willing to take, a heartfelt apology. The Veterans Center's modest building stood just off the main street, an unassuming place that Karen had driven past countless times without giving it a second thought. She felt a pang of shame as she walked toward the entrance, realizing how invisible this place, and the people it served, had always been to her. Now, standing on its doorstep, she felt out of place and uncertain. Inside, the center was a mix of functional and welcoming, with bulletin boards plastered with support resources and flyers for job training and housing programs. A young woman at the reception desk looked up as Karen entered, giving her a polite smile. "Hello, can I help you?" The receptionist asked, her tone friendly but professional. Yes, Karen began, suddenly unsure of what to say. I'm looking for a man named John Williams. I think he's a regular here. The receptionist's face softened. Oh, John. He's a great guy. He's in the lounge area right now, but I can let him know you're here. May I ask who's visiting him? Karen hesitated. She didn't know how John would react to seeing her, or even if he'd be willing to speak with her. But she forced herself to answer. My name is Karen Whitfield. We met at Riverside Park last week. The receptionist's expression shifted, and Karen sensed a flicker of recognition. She hadn't anticipated how many people might know about her actions at the park. She felt exposed, but she nodded, silently acknowledging her role in the situation. The receptionist gave a small nod, clearly understanding but saying nothing. I'll let him know you're here. Please have a seat. Karen sat down, her hands twisting together in her lap as she waited, each second stretching out painfully. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest, and for a fleeting moment, she considered leaving before he arrived. But the shame she felt held her in place, anchoring her to the uncomfortable reality she created. A few minutes later, she looked up to see John walking toward her, his face a mixture of surprise and guardedness. He was dressed in clean clothes now, and his face looked less weary than she remembered, though his eyes still held that same quiet resilience. Mrs. Whitfield, he asked, his tone polite but wary. What brings you here? Karen stood, feeling her words catch in her throat. She hadn't thought about what she would actually say. She'd just known she needed to apologize. Now, faced with the man she'd hurt, the gravity of her actions hit her even harder. Mr. Williams, John, she began, her voice shaking slightly. I owe you an apology. What I did in the park, it was wrong. I treated you terribly, and I'm so sorry. John watched her, his expression unreadable. Why now? He asked quietly. Why come here, days later? Karen's face flushed as she struggled to find the right words. I didn't understand before. I thought I was protecting the community, but I was only protecting myself from things I didn't want to confront. I saw myself as someone who stood up for what was right, but all I did was look down on someone who needed help. She looked down, feeling her voice falter. Since that day, my life has changed. I lost my job, my friends, my reputation. It forced me to look at myself differently. I can't change what I did, but I'm trying to be better. There was a long silence as John looked at her, his gaze thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his tone was gentle but firm. It takes courage to admit you were wrong, but an apology doesn't change what happened. Words can't erase actions. Karen nodded, swallowing hard. I know. I don't expect you to forgive me. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. John's face softened slightly, and he nodded, his posture relaxing a bit. I appreciate that, he said simply. It's more than most people would do. They stood in silence for a moment, neither knowing what to say next. Karen felt a strange sense of relief, as though a weight she'd been carrying had lightened, even if only a little. As she was about to turn and leave, John cleared his throat. If you really want to understand, you're welcome to join me tomorrow. There's a breakfast for veterans at St. Mark's Church. It's nothing fancy, but it's a place to meet people who've been through similar things. Karen blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected this invitation and felt a pang of hesitation, but she nodded. I'd like that. Thank you, John. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. 8 a.m., don't be late. The next morning, Karen arrived at St. Mark's Church, feeling out of place and unsure. The small, unadorned building was already buzzing with people, a line forming near the entrance where a group of volunteers handed out breakfast trays. Inside, rows of tables were filled with men and women chatting quietly, some laughing, others keeping to themselves. She spotted John seated near the back, talking with an older man whose eyes sparkled with quiet humor. When he saw her, he gave a nod. gesturing for her to join them. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitfield," he greeted, a slight smile playing on his lips. "Glad to see you made it." "Please call me Karen," she replied, smiling nervously as she sat down. The other man, who introduced himself as Frank, gave her a curious look but offered a friendly nod. As they ate, John and Frank spoke casually about their experiences, sharing stories of their service with a mix of pride and sadness. Karen listened, her heart growing heavy as she heard about the hardships they'd faced, returning home to a world that felt unfamiliar, struggling with PTSD, and finding themselves without the support they needed. For the first time, Karen began to understand the depth of John's situation and the countless challenges he'd faced in a system that seemed designed to ignore him. Frank leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You know, most folks don't see us as people anymore. To them, we're just another problem to look past, like a pothole in the road. They think if they don't see us, we don't exist." Karen felt a lump in her throat. She realized, painfully, that she had been one of those people, someone who looked at John and saw only her own discomfort reflected back at her. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't see you. I didn't see any of you. I only saw what I was afraid of." John nodded thoughtfully. "Fear does strange things to people. It makes them see things that aren't there, and it blinds them to the things that are. But recognizing that is a step forward." The rest of the meal passed quietly, with Karen listening more than she spoke, taking in the stories around her. By the time she left, she felt both humbled and enlightened, a sense of purpose beginning to replace the shame that had haunted her since that day in the park. That afternoon, as she walked back through Riverside Park, Karen felt as though she were seeing it with new eyes. She noticed the small details she'd ignored before: the wildflowers blooming along the path, the birds flitting between branches, the way the sunlight danced on the pond. It was as if her perspective had shifted, allowing her to see the beauty in the things she'd taken for granted. She decided to sit on the bench where she'd first met John, closing her eyes and letting the sounds of the park wash over her. She thought about all the people she'd hurt, both directly and indirectly, with her prejudice. The weight of that realization settled over her, heavy but not unbearable. In that moment, she made a decision. She would do more than just apologize. She would use this experience to change, to become someone who not only acknowledged her faults but actively worked to correct them. Over the following weeks, Karen began volunteering regularly at the Veteran Center, offering her time and resources to help veterans navigate the complex processes that often stood between them and the assistance they needed. She found herself learning about programs she hadn't even known existed, and in helping others, she began to find a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. John watched her with a mix of curiosity and cautious optimism. He saw her dedication and the sincerity with which she approached her work, and though he remained somewhat guarded, he found himself beginning to respect her efforts. One evening, after a long day at the center, Karen approached John, a hesitant smile on her face. "I know I can't change the past," she began, "but I want to do whatever I can to make things right." John regarded her silently for a moment, then nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Actions speak louder than words, Mrs. Whitfield. And so far, your actions are speaking pretty clearly." Karen felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, a small glimmer of hope that perhaps, one day, she could truly make amends. As Karen continued her volunteer work, her world began to change. The shame and bitterness that had once consumed her gave way to a quiet resilience, a determination to be better. She found herself connecting with people she'd once ignored, learning their stories, and understanding the struggles they faced. Her journey was far from over, but she was beginning to see the path forward. And though she knew she had a long way to go, she was grateful for the chance to walk it. Grateful, in a strange way, for that day in the park that had set her on this course. Because sometimes, she realized, it was the moments of our greatest failures that led us to become the people we were meant to be. Let me know when you're ready for part 4, where Karen's transformation continues, and she finds new ways to support John and the veteran community. Bridging the divide. A few months had passed since that fateful day in Riverside Park, and Karen Whitfield's life had changed in ways she couldn't have imagined. Each morning, she rose early, making her way to the Veterans Center, where she now volunteered regularly. The once pristine image she clung to had been replaced by the humble attire of a volunteer, a simple shirt, jeans, and comfortable shoes. She was no longer the Karen of polished surfaces and appearances. She had stripped away those facades to uncover something deeper within herself. Her days were filled with tasks she never imagined herself doing: filing paperwork, helping veterans navigate confusing application processes, even scrubbing floors when needed. She felt no resentment toward these tasks. Instead, she found purpose in them, a quiet satisfaction in knowing her hands were working to serve others. John Williams, meanwhile, had watched her transformation with cautious skepticism. At first, he'd assumed her volunteer work would be a short-lived attempt at redemption, another act of self-serving penance. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, he began to see that her commitment was genuine. Karen's presence at the center was no longer an act of apology. It was a part of her, a path she'd chosen to walk without expectation of praise or recognition. One afternoon, as Karen was assisting a young veteran with a housing application, John approached her, a slight smile on his face. "Mrs. Whitfield," he began, then corrected himself. "Karen, I'd like to thank you for everything you've been doing here. It's not something we see often. Someone from your background, dedicating themselves to this kind of work." Karen looked up, her cheeks flushing. She still wasn't used to praise, especially not from someone like John, whose respect she'd come to value deeply. "Thank you, John. But honestly, it's the least I can do. I spent so long ignoring people. I can't change what I did, but I can try to do better." John nodded, a thoughtful look in his eyes. "And you have. You're not the same person I met that day in the park." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling over her. She felt a strange mix of pride and humility, knowing that the man she'd once wronged now saw her differently, not as the person she had been, but as the person she was becoming. That evening, Karen attended her first support group for veterans and their families at the center. Though she wasn't a veteran herself, she had been invited by Dave Martinez, who thought it might help her understand the community she now served. The room was filled with men and women of all ages, each carrying their own stories, their own battles. Some had visible scars, others bore wounds that couldn't be seen. As she listened to their stories, tales of struggle, survival, and resilience, Karen felt herself moved in ways she hadn't anticipated. She heard from veterans who had lost friends in combat, who had returned home to a world that no longer felt familiar. She listened to families who had watched loved ones struggle with PTSD, feeling helpless as they tried to provide support. And as each story unfolded, she felt a deepening connection to the people she had once dismissed. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Am not a veteran," she began awkwardly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here because I've been volunteering at the center, and because I wronged someone in a way that I can't fully make up for." She glanced at John, who sat across the room, watching her with a steady gaze. "A few months ago, I was a different person," she continued. "I saw the world through a narrow lens, one that only showed me what I wanted to see. I judged people without understanding their lives or their struggles, and in doing so, I hurt someone. Someone who deserved my respect, not my judgment." The room was silent as she spoke, her words hanging in the air. "I'm here because I want to understand. I want to know the stories of people who have sacrificed so much, who have given so much, and who deserve better than what I once gave them." As she finished, she felt the weight of her own words settling over her, a quiet sense of vulnerability that was both frightening and freeing. The people in the room looked at her with a mix of empathy and understanding, as though they, too, saw the changes she had undergone. In the weeks that followed, Karen found herself increasingly involved in the center's programs. She began attending training sessions, learning about PTSD, trauma, and the unique challenges faced by veterans. She immersed herself in the work, spending hours researching resources and connecting with local organizations to build a network of support for those in need. One day, Dave approached her with an idea. "Karen, we're organizing a community event, a fundraiser for veterans. It's going to be a big one, and we could use your help with outreach. Given your background, I think you'd be perfect for this." Karen's eyes lit up. She hadn't expected to be trusted with such a responsibility, but she felt honored. "I'd love to help. What do you need me to do?" Dave explained the event, a gala that would bring together local businesses, community leaders, and residents to raise funds for the Veteran Center. The goal was to provide housing assistance, job training, and mental health resources for veterans struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. As Karen threw herself into the preparations, she reached out to contacts she hadn't spoken to in months. Many were surprised to hear from her, given her recent fall from grace, but she found that some were willing to listen, intrigued by her newfound dedication to a cause that had once seemed so far removed from her world. One evening, as she was finalizing the guest list, she noticed John lingering near the door of her office at the center. She waved him in, motioning for him to take a seat. "What's on your mind, John?" she asked, smiling warmly. He shifted in his chair, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I wanted to ask you something. About the event." "Of course. What's up?" John hesitated, then looked her in the eye. "Would you mind if I shared my story at the gala? Not just the story of my service, but what happened after. How I ended up on that bench in Riverside Park." Karen felt a lump in her throat. She knew how private John was, how reluctant he'd been to share the details of his life with others. This was a monumental step for him, and she was honored that he trusted her enough to bring it up. "John, I think that would be incredible," she replied softly. "Your story deserves to be heard." John nodded, a look of quiet determination in his eyes. "It's not easy, you know, talking about it. But if my story can help others understand, if it can show people what we go through when we come back, then maybe it's worth it." As he left, Karen felt a surge of pride for the man she'd once looked down upon. He had shown her the meaning of strength, resilience, and forgiveness, and now he was willing to share his journey with the world, to bridge the divide between himself and the people who had once dismissed him. The night of the gala arrived, and the Veteran Center was transformed into a beautiful event space. Tables were adorned with candles and flowers, and the room buzzed with anticipation as guests mingled and waited for the evening's program to begin. Karen, dressed in a simple yet elegant black dress, moved through the crowd, greeting guests and thanking them for their support. She felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness, knowing that John's story would be the centerpiece of the evening. When it was time for him to speak, she took a seat near the stage, her heart pounding as she watched him approach the podium. He looked out over the crowd, his face calm but serious, his eyes reflecting the weight of his experiences. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady. "My name is John Williams. I served in the Marine Corps for over 20 years. I've seen a lot of things, some good, some bad. And when I came home, I thought the hardest part was over." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room. "But the truth is, coming home was the hardest part. I was lost, struggling to find my place in a world that felt different, strange. I had PTSD, memories that haunted me, and I didn't know where to turn. I ended up homeless, moving from place to place, feeling like I didn't belong anywhere." Karen felt tears prick her eyes as she listened, her chest tightening as John spoke. His words were raw, unfiltered, and they resonated deeply with everyone in the room. "And then," he continued, "I met someone who saw me as less than a person, who looked at me and saw only what they were afraid of." He glanced briefly at Karen, a faint smile touching his lips. "But that encounter changed both of us. It forced us to confront our own prejudices, our own fears. And it led me here, to this place, to a community that saw me not as a problem, but as a person. The audience was silent, hanging on his every word. So tonight, I'm here to ask for your help. Not just for me, but for all the veterans who come home and find themselves struggling to adjust. We need your support, your compassion, and your understanding. Because we're not just veterans, we're people. We're your neighbors, your friends, your family. As he finished, the room erupted in applause, a standing ovation that echoed through the hall. Karen felt a surge of pride and gratitude, her heart swelling as she watched John accept the crowd's admiration with quiet dignity. After the gala, as the guests filtered out, John approached Karen, a look of contentment on his face. "Thank you, Karen," he said simply, "for everything." She smiled, feeling a warmth that she hadn't known was possible. "No, John. Thank you for showing me a different way to see the world." They stood together in the quiet of the hall, two people from different worlds who had found common ground, united by a shared journey of redemption and understanding. And as they looked out over the empty room, Karen felt a sense of peace, knowing that this was only the beginning of the difference they could make, together. A new mission. The gala had been a resounding success, raising thousands of dollars to support the Veterans Center's initiatives. The morning after, Karen sat with Dave Martinez and John Williams, going over the event's impact. Karen's heart swelled as they recounted the overwhelming support they'd received. Donations from local businesses, partnerships with mental health providers, and commitments to provide housing resources for struggling veterans. But even with the positive changes, Karen felt there was more she could do. She looked over at Dave, her mind churning with ideas. "Dave, I've been thinking. I want to start a new program for the center, something that goes beyond just meeting the basic needs of our veterans. I think we need something that truly prepares them for life beyond these walls, something that provides stability and purpose." Dave raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you have in mind, Karen?" Karen took a deep breath, trying to put her thoughts into words. "I'm envisioning a job training program combined with mentorship. Not just any job training, though. I want it to be a community initiative where local businesses partner with us to provide employment opportunities tailored to veteran skills. And more than just jobs, I want them to have mentors. People who understand their struggles, who can support them as they transition back into the civilian workforce." John, who had been listening quietly, nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like it could make a real difference. Most veterans come out of service with valuable skills, but translating those skills into civilian jobs isn't easy. If we had a program like this, I think it would give people something to look forward to, something to work toward." Dave's eyes lit up, his mind already racing with possibilities. "This could be big, Karen. Really big. But it won't be easy. We'll need community buy-in, funding, and a dedicated team to run it." Karen's face softened with determination. "I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I've spent too long taking things for granted. It's time I start giving back in a meaningful way." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning, meetings, and outreach. Karen found herself working late into the evenings, drafting proposals, researching grants, and meeting with local business owners to pitch her idea. She faced plenty of challenges along the way: skepticism from some quarters, funding obstacles, and bureaucratic red tape, but she persisted, driven by a newfound sense of purpose. As she navigated this new path, Karen's network grew. People who had once seen her as aloof and unapproachable now admired her dedication, impressed by her willingness to roll up her sleeves and do the work. She became a familiar face in the local community, building connections that were genuine and rooted in mutual respect. One afternoon, she met with the CEO of a prominent manufacturing company, a man named Thomas Grant, who had a reputation for supporting veterans. As she pitched her idea, Karen could see him nodding thoughtfully, a glimmer of interest in his eyes. "Karen," Thomas said after she finished, "I think you're onto something important here. Veterans have skills that are in high demand in our industry, but the transition can be tough. I'd be happy to partner with the center on this initiative. We could start with a small cohort and provide both on-the-job training and mentorship." Karen's eyes lit up with excitement. "Thank you, Mr. Grant. This means so much. I promise we'll do everything we can to make this a success." Thomas gave her a warm smile. "Please, call me Tom. And Karen, it's the least we can do. These men and women have served our country. Now, it's our turn to serve them." As they shook hands, Karen felt a surge of optimism. This partnership was a major step forward, a testament to the progress she'd made and the impact her efforts could have. The program, named Pathways to Purpose, launched with a cohort of 10 veterans, each paired with a mentor from one of the participating businesses. The program offered intensive training in various trades, workshops on financial management, and personal development sessions. But most importantly, it provided a support system, an environment where veterans could feel understood and valued. Karen threw herself into overseeing the program, coordinating workshops, and checking in with each veteran to track their progress. She was constantly on the move, yet she found herself energized, motivated by the transformations she saw taking place. Each success story fueled her passion, and each setback only strengthened her resolve to keep going. John was one of the first participants in Pathways to Purpose, paired with a mentor from a local logistics company. Though he'd initially been reluctant to participate, fearing that his age and background might hold him back, he quickly found himself thriving. His mentor, a former Army surgeon turned operations manager, understood his experiences and pushed him to recognize his potential. Within weeks, John had gained valuable skills in supply chain management and logistics, a field where his military experience proved invaluable. One day, after a particularly successful training session, John approached Karen, a look of gratitude in his eyes. "Karen," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I can't thank you enough for what you've done here. I didn't think I'd ever feel useful again. But this program has given me something to work toward, a sense of purpose I thought I'd lost." Karen smiled, her own eyes misting over. "You don't have to thank me, John. This is as much your success as it is mine. You're the one who put in the hard work, who chose to believe in yourself again." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Still, if it hadn't been for you, well, let's just say I'd still be sitting on that park bench, wondering where my next meal would come from." Karen reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're more resilient than you give yourself credit for, John. You've taught me so much, about strength, about compassion. I think, in a way, we've helped each other." They shared a moment of quiet understanding, a connection born from their shared journey of redemption. Karen had come to see John not just as a friend, but as a mentor in his own right, a man whose wisdom and humility had reshaped her understanding of the world. The impact of Pathways to Purpose began to ripple through the community. Word spread about the program's success, and other local businesses expressed interest in joining. The Veterans Center received calls from organizations across the state, eager to learn more about the initiative and potentially replicate it in their own communities. Karen's reputation grew, but this time, it wasn't because of her social status or material wealth. She was respected for her dedication, admired for her empathy, and known as someone who fought for those who couldn't always fight for themselves. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. But even as she celebrated these victories, Karen remained grounded, never forgetting the journey that had brought her here. She knew that her growth was ongoing, that she still had much to learn and many people to serve. Each day brought new challenges, but she faced them with a resilience that came from her own transformation. One evening, after a long day at the center, Karen and John took a walk through Riverside Park. It was the first time they'd returned to the place where their paths had crossed months earlier, and the memories of that day were still vivid in both of their minds. "Funny, isn't it?" John mused as they strolled along the gravel path. "How one moment, one decision, can change everything." Karen nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. "I never thought that day in the park would lead to this. If you told me then that I'd be here, walking through the park with you, I would have laughed in your face." John chuckled, the sound rich and warm. Life has a way of surprising us. Sometimes it takes a moment of reckoning to push us in the right direction. They'd reached the bench where they'd first met, and Karen felt a pang of nostalgia as she looked at it. She sat down, her mind drifting back to the person she'd been and the person she'd become. "John, thank you," she said softly, her voice laced with emotion, "for giving me a chance to be better, for showing me a different way to see the world." John sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the pond. "You did that on your own, Karen. You made the choice to change, to open your heart. Not everyone would have done that." She sighed, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "I think maybe I was afraid to see people, really see them. It was easier to live in my own world, to focus on things that felt safe. But you showed me what it means to step outside of that bubble, to face the parts of myself I didn't want to see." They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, the sounds of the park filling the quiet between them. Karen knew that she still had a long way to go, that her journey of growth and self-discovery was far from over. But she was grateful for the path she was on, for the chance to make amends and forge a new legacy. As dusk settled over the park, John turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "Karen, I've been thinking, maybe it's time I give back too. You've helped me find a sense of purpose, and I want to do the same for others. Maybe I could mentor some of the younger veterans in the program, help them navigate this transition like you helped me." Karen's eyes lit up with excitement. "John, that's a wonderful idea. You'd be an incredible mentor. You have so much wisdom, so much to offer. I think it would make a huge difference." John smiled, a glint of pride in his eyes. "Well, I guess it's time for me to pay it forward." As they left the park, Karen felt a sense of hope for the future, a belief that Pathways to Purpose would continue to grow, fueled by the dedication of people like John, people who had found strength in their struggles and were ready to lift others along the way. And as they walked side by side, Karen knew that her life's mission had only just begun. She had found her path, her purpose, and she was ready to keep building a future that would make a lasting impact on the lives of those who had been forgotten and overlooked. Let me know when you're ready for Part 6, where Karen and John face one last challenge that tests their newfound resilience and commitment to the community they've built together. Rising from the ashes. It was a brisk autumn morning, and Riverside Park glowed with the vibrant colors of fallen leaves. Karen Whitfield and John Williams walked side by side through the park, their breaths fogging in the crisp air. The past few months had seen incredible strides for Pathways to Purpose. The program had expanded, with more veterans enrolling and new businesses partnering to provide training, mentorship, and job opportunities. Karen and John had become close friends, each supporting the other through the challenges and triumphs that had defined their journey. But on this particular day, an unsettling feeling lingered in the air. Earlier that morning, Karen had received a call from Dave Martinez, the director of the Veteran Center. There had been whispers of a budget cut within the city council, funding that the center and Pathways to Purpose depended on to continue their work. Rumors suggested that the council planned to reallocate resources, directing funds away from social programs to support a new luxury housing development in town. As Karen and John reached their favorite bench overlooking the pond, she turned to him, her expression troubled. "John, this is serious. If the council pulls funding, we could lose everything we've worked for. All these people who finally have a chance to rebuild their lives. They'd be right back where they started." John's face darkened, a mixture of frustration and resolve in his eyes. "We can't let that happen. These veterans have given everything for this country. To take away the little support they have now would be unforgivable." Karen nodded, her mind racing. "I think we need to attend the next city council meeting. We have to make them understand how crucial this program is, not just for the veterans but for the entire community." John's gaze softened as he looked at her, a hint of pride in his eyes. "You've come a long way, Karen. A year ago, I don't think you would have fought for something like this. But now you're leading the charge." Karen smiled, feeling the surge of determination. "I never would have thought I'd be here either. But if I have to fight, I will. I'm not letting them take this away from us." The city council meeting was scheduled for the following week, and in the days leading up to it, Karen and John worked tirelessly to gather support. They organized a petition, collecting signatures from veterans, community members, and local business owners who believed in the importance of Pathways to Purpose. Karen also reached out to the local media, arranging for a reporter to cover the story and bring attention to their cause. On the night of the meeting, the council chamber was packed. Rows of veterans sat shoulder to shoulder, their expressions resolute as they prepared to stand up for the program that had given them hope. Members of the community filled every remaining seat, and some even stood in the back, all eager to show their support. Karen felt a mix of nerves and anticipation as she stood at the podium, facing the council members who would decide the fate of Pathways to Purpose. John stood beside her, a steady presence that gave her the courage to speak. "Good evening, council members," Karen began, her voice calm but firm. "My name is Karen Whitfield, and I'm here on behalf of Pathways to Purpose, a program dedicated to helping our veterans find meaningful employment and support as they transition back into civilian life." She took a deep breath, meeting the eyes of each council member. These men and women have served our country with honor, facing unimaginable challenges. When they return home, they deserve more than to be left to fend for themselves. Pathways to Purpose isn't just a job training program. It's a lifeline. It gives veterans the chance to rebuild their lives, to find stability, and to regain a sense of purpose. One of the council members, a man named Harold Reeve, who had been vocal about redirecting funds to the luxury housing project, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Ms. Whitfield," he interrupted, his tone dismissive, "we understand the importance of veteran support, but our budget is limited. We have to make difficult choices, and this new development will bring significant revenue to the city." Karen clenched her fists, willing herself to remain composed. "With all due respect, Councilman Reeve, what good is revenue if we're neglecting the people who built this community? These veterans have sacrificed everything, and now they're asking for just a fraction of the support they deserve." John stepped forward, his voice steady and strong. "I'm a veteran myself, and I know what it's like to come home to a world that feels foreign and unforgiving. I was homeless before Pathways to Purpose. This program gave me a second chance, a way to move forward. Without it, I don't know where I'd be today." The council chamber was silent as John's words sank in, the weight of his story evident in the faces of everyone present. One of the council members, a woman named Sarah Park, leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Mr. Williams, thank you for sharing your story. It's clear that this program has had a profound impact on your life. I'd like to hear from some of the other veterans who have benefited from Pathways to Purpose." One by one, veterans in the audience stood to share their experiences. They spoke of the challenges they'd faced, the struggles they'd endured, and the hope they'd found through the program. Each story was a testament to the power of community and the transformative impact of Pathways to Purpose. As the last veteran finished speaking, Karen looked around the room, feeling a swell of pride and gratitude for the people who had come together to support one another. This was more than just a program. It was a family, a network of people bound by resilience, compassion, and a shared commitment to lifting each other up. Councilman Reeve looked visibly uncomfortable, and he cleared his throat, glancing at his notes. "We appreciate all of your testimonies, and will take everything you've shared into consideration. A decision will be made at the end of the meeting." As the council deliberated, Karen, John, and the other veterans waited outside the chamber, their nerves stretched thin. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one adding to the tension in the room. Karen paced, her mind racing with worry. What if their efforts weren't enough? What if the council chose money over people? Finally, the doors opened, and the council members filed back in, their expressions solemn. Karen and John returned to the podium, bracing themselves for the decision. Councilwoman Sarah Park stood, a gentle smile on her face. After careful consideration, we have decided to continue funding Pathways to Purpose. The Council recognizes the vital role this program plays in our community and the importance of supporting our veterans. The room erupted in applause, and Karen felt tears prick her eyes as she exchanged a look of relief and gratitude with John. Their fight had paid off. They had won. As the applause subsided, Councilman Reeves spoke, his tone begrudging. I still believe we must make sacrifices to ensure this city's growth, but I cannot deny the impact this program has had. Perhaps in the future, we can find ways to balance these priorities. Karen smiled, feeling a sense of triumph that went beyond the funding. They had not only preserved Pathways to Purpose, but they had also shown the Council and the entire community that veterans' lives were worth investing in. That no revenue or development could replace the value of human dignity and support. That evening, Karen, John, and the other veterans gathered at the center to celebrate. The air was filled with laughter and camaraderie as they shared stories and toasted to their victory. Karen felt a warmth in her heart that went beyond words, a feeling of belonging, of being part of something greater than herself. As the night wore on, she and John stepped outside, the quiet of the night settling around them. They looked up at the stars, a comfortable silence between them. Karen, John began, his voice soft. You did something incredible today. You fought for us, for all of us. I can't thank you enough. Karen turned to him, her eyes shining. I didn't do it alone, John. You and everyone else. You're the reason we won. I just helped share your stories. He nodded, a thoughtful look in his eyes. Maybe, but you gave us a voice when we didn't have one. You reminded this community of our worth. Karen felt her chest tighten with emotion. You all taught me what it means to truly serve others, to give without expecting anything in return. I spent so long focused on myself, on things that didn't matter. But now, I've found my purpose, and I'm not letting go of it. They stood there, side by side, two people whose lives had been forever changed by a chance encounter in a park. Karen knew that her journey was far from over, that there would be more battles to fight, more lives to touch. But she was ready, strengthened by the people she now considered family, and the purpose she had found in serving them. As they looked out over the city lights, Karen felt a quiet peace settle within her. She had risen from her own ashes, shedding the remnants of her former self to embrace a life of compassion, service, and love. And she knew, with unwavering certainty, that she would spend the rest of her days fighting for those who had once been forgotten, just as she had once forgotten them. Because sometimes, she realized, it was in fighting for others that we truly found ourselves.